Please come up, everyone. Hey, Maria, yes. KATJA, sit down. I can see Admiral VANDIER is online, although the audience cannot yet see you. BART is coming up. Who else are we missing? So Nathan is online, and Guillaume, JEROMIN is here. I don't see Guillaume. Oh, you're there. Okay, good. So we, please sit there, please sit there. So this next panel is really trying to shine a light, of course, on the big defense piece. This is not a security and politics or policy conference in the sense that we're not going to just obviously focus on the geopolitical situation, which is what it is. But given the focus of the event, which is on sovereignty and started from digital, we certainly want to explore very much the question of how the current focus on rearming Europe, expanding our investment in defense, is also going to be instrumental to boost up our own capabilities in digital, in tech, in industry, of course. It is well known that investment in defense is a major vehicle for this kind of industrial projects. So we are at a moment which is unique in this sense. And of course, there are huge challenges. I don't want to go into detail, but we know Europe has, in some measure, not spent enough on defense. There are big plans to spend much more. There are views that even the bigger numbers, 6.3 trillion in the next decade of money being spent are going to be inadequate, or they're not going to be able to be spent. There are proposals. Then there is the big question of whether, when we spend that money, we spend it wisely. There is a lot of questions and concerns, of course, about duplication and inefficient spending. On the other hand, and I continue to say this is the theme of the day, we know that Europe has got tremendous capabilities in some of the key advanced tech components that are essential to the defense machine today. And Ukraine, of course, is a prime example of all this. So I won't indulge any further with the background because we have an exceptional panel to be able to discuss multiple aspects of this. I really want to be starting thanking Admiral VANDIER, who is from NATO headquarters and very kindly has agreed to come on and to give us his views. Admiral, thank you so much for joining. You have a room full of eager participants. I want to really start with you and ask you, how do you actually see particularly this question of the way in which the current imperative to boost, to rearm Europe will play with the other imperative, which is to also power up our own capabilities and strength in tech and industrial domains. Would you give us your opinion on that, and then we can go from there.
Thank you for inviting me in this panel. So I'm speaking you from Norfolk in Virginia, where the HQ of Supreme Allied Commander Transformation is. One of the things we need not to forget is that we have a strategic question to solve before any industrial issue. A strategic problem is what kind of I would say, consequences of the relations we have with our partners and our enemies or adversaries. And so what do we want to achieve? Because it's a question of achieving something. So you have, I would say, the reset or the change of the transatlantic relation. You have the question of the future of Europe and Russia. And you have the future of the relation between Europe and China. And depending the choices, the political choices that are made, you will not have the same ministry problem to solve. And this is important to put in front of everybody, because we think, and most of our people think, that rearming is just about building weapons. And so they think that it's just as building a bunker for atomic defense. You will build a big facility, then you will put some milk in it, some sugar, you will have the Netflix connection, and then you can go fishing. It's not about building a huge stockpile. It's about addressing a strategic question. And so it's where we are we are in a difficult moment, because the military tool we built after the Cold War was one to address limited crisis. And so we have that, it's a heritage. And so today we need to shift to something else, and nobody really knows what is this future. You don't have very, I would say, thoughtful papers about the consequences of the US, what is the long-term perspective of Russia, and how we deal with China, which is also a competitor, but could be a sort of a blackmailing power to Europe. So I will dig on that, because this big question has not been addressed. And so the construction of the military is a difficult piece if this question has not been set up. What we see since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, and we knew that before, is that in fact the mass is necessary. And the width, even for a country as Russia, which has a limited GDP, the ability of this country to turn its industry to war industry makes a huge problem for us. The figures are just amazing. For example, each year they launch 55,000 Shaheds on Ukraine. That's meant to kill these assaults that are maybe 1,000 a night. It needs mass, and it needs affordable mass, because we can't produce, because of the money, because of the industry, because of the raw materials, the number of missiles we intended to have to protect our cities or our facilities. So today we need to invent something else. And so the challenge for the West, and it's the same for the US, it's to build the affordable mass. What is cheap enough, good enough, and that will be able to make the thing, to address the threat. That drives me to, in fact, a mix. In fact, we need to think the rearmament as a mix of ramping up the legacy. So for sure, we need some ships, we need some aircraft, we need some tanks, and all the, I would say, the World War II-like stuff we see in Ukraine. But we also need the new things that will give us room of maneuver. And that exists. So the question now is that the demand signal from the government exists, because today it's very limited. So it's about robotics, it's about large-scale drones in all domains, it's about the use of commercial IT that exists, and which is very difficult to implement in the military because of old-fashioned security rules regarding IT. And so when we have this mix, we have when we work on ACT, which I call force lethality enhancement. And we've made some calculus with some companies and with some non-profit organizations. The ramp up of the lethality is a 30% magnitude with this mix. That means, for example, if you have an armored brigade, and that you are able to make around this armored brigade drones, UAVs, robotics to make the supply, you have a better use of the people, a diminished lethality, you have a better resilience of your people, and you have a better lethality. The fires give you more impact. On Ukraine, for example, using these techniques, they have been able, we had a conference last Friday in Brussels, the number of people they say killing the soldiers, they kill a month, has raised from 10,000 to 30,000 using that kind of techniques. And so this affordable mass is really something we need to build. And so it's where our digital debt in Europe doesn't make that easy, because most of the, I would say, the key components of this IT is not in Europe. We have the brain, we can make the software, but we don't have the components. And so that goes back to the first question, because if we have a strategic problem and we are not able to address it alone because all the supply chain is out of our country, out of Europe, then we have a problem. And so you see that it's a problem that comes from the adaptation between the strategy and the means, and the way to address the things. And so are we resilient in certain domains, and what are the technology we intend to develop in order to be resilient and not dependent on what on the others? We had a Rusi speaker on last Friday that was saying that in Ukraine, in fact, it's the Chinese industrial base which is fighting against the Chinese industrial base, because the drones are made in the same factories. And so you see this kind of battle. Would we have a problem with China? Imagine that comes from US, but that drifts to Europe. Then we will have a problem to sustain all the stuff we need to build. So that's a great question for the political stakeholders. So I'd say strategic alignment and then industrial alignment.
So this is a very good framing, and of course I hear you when you say that this bigger strategic landscape question is this sort of the threshold issue here, and then there is the question of how you actually think and deploy the industrial effort. And of course you are talk about a mixture of traditional, but we are looking now very much in Europe and in the tech sector about the opportunity that is created, if you like, once in a lifetime, when we are so clear that we need to really multiply our effort to boost these more advanced technologies. And as you say, the problem you describe is the one that is common to many sectors in Europe. We are intertwined. The presence of non-European assets is pervasive. And so the issue is, can we use this moment in time to really boost European products, European solution, European invention? Can we use it to scale up, to push our startup ecosystem, to improve our ability to respond in a more European way, or at least less dependencies? I think I'm restating some of what you said, but do you see this as being a goal which is explicitly now really taken into account when people think about procurement and how to boost the military?
So that's a great question. And so we worked on the startup journey. So you are two engineers going up from the major engineering schools in Europe. You have a good idea. You think that you will make the point. You build something. You are helped because you will find some capital to make your system work. It's a difficult journey, but imagine you can do that. Some do. And then you need to LBO, you need to ramp up. And that makes this where lies the difficulty. Because where is the demand signal in the nations? Right. In the budgets. And so if the defense budgets of the EU members do not create the demand signal on these new technologies, then they just die. So today we have something which is a little bit tricky, in that all the people that are inventing tools for Europeans, they achieve, in fact, the best of them go to Ukraine and they achieve to sell something to Ukraine because there is a massive demand there. But so on the European side, on the European armies, the demand signal is extremely poor. It's less than 1% of the budget. I say very, very low. And so you are, if you are the CEO of a startup, you don't know who to sell to in Europe. And so it's where there is a need for political guidance. That means the increase of budgets need to take into account this new technology and create the demand signal, because it's not a market. It's a state-owned, I would say, budget. And so if the governments do not, say, create the demand signal and allocate some money to the new, then that will never work. And so my fear is that if we do not do that, then we will wait. We will just do the legacy rearmament, a very slow one. We will have more tanks, more ships, more aircraft, and so I say more of the same. And the day we will trigger a huge crisis, we will have to buy these new things outside of Europe. And the fact is, all these new capabilities are very, very IT dependent. And so the loss of sovereignty of buying this stuff outside Europe will be tremendous. And the conduct of the war itself will be dependent on, I would say, foreign suppliers. You've seen what happened on Mr. Musk, Starlink, the discussion with Ukraine. So if Europeans don't have the sovereign tools, then they will not have sovereign policies.
So you rightly emphasize the importance of demand signals. That's all important. And of course, as you say, this is not a market. The demand signal needs to come from governments. But how do you see this playing out when one of the issues we know is that governments will always have a bias, for example, for national suppliers? And this is something which is to be resolved if we're going to just boost up the European capability. You can't just, it creates duplication, it creates inefficiencies. Do you see this as something that there is an aware of, as somebody is actually pushing, aside from, you know, yourself, but what about the decision makers in the individual countries? Where is that going?
So we experiment that in NATO every day. We have something which is called the STANAG, which is the standard of NATO. So it's a standard agreement to make a lot of things compatible. So not only the systems themselves, the software, the spare parts, but even the use of it. But so these standards, as a result today, 50% of the standards are not applied. 50%, which we are supposed to work together, but in fact, what has been built is not compatible. I'll give you an example on artillery. Artillery is not about shooting a shell. Today, to make it accurate, you need to transfer data from the system to the shell when it's shot. And so the standards for this are very different. Why? So today you have approximately 11 standards in Europe that are not compatible. That means that the shell A can't go on the howitzer B. And why we've done that? Because all the things were oriented to foreign sales. And so it's just as the cartridge or printer, when you sell to a Middle East stakeholder howitzers, you want him to buy the shells. And so you create something which is not compatible with your competitor. And so today, the internal competition between European stakeholders has driven to very different standards. And even the US have played this game. So I think something we need, if we want to change the thing, we need to be very bullish on the application on common standards. And that will be the condition to create something that looks like a common industrial base. Elsewhere, it will be a sort of fight between the countries to impose their system by bilateral, trilateral, multilateral agreements, but that will not make something which is unified and that address the geopolitical problem we have. I go back to my first point. That are political questions. So you can say everything about Europe, but see, if the political leaders are not able to solve this, then Europe doesn't exist. It's nations, it's competition within the nations, and then you are not able to define Europe as one. And so that's a big question we have to solve in NATO. I've launched this year a huge, I say, very energetic standardization effort. We've worked. I asked all the chiefs of defense to have their own direct advisor on interoperability, trying to solve this. But I know that my glass ceiling is about the politics. It's the policy that are implemented in all the countries that doesn't make that possible.
And last question, because I know you're pressed for time. You know, you of course describe the need for standardization in order to create some sort of measure of commonality and agreement for any of this to happen. And of course, as you say, it's in the hands of politicians, the will to move in that direction. How do you see, and what is the timing for that? Because the general sense is, of course, we are in a hurry, but then you have the glacial era of decision-making and you know, in many ways, lack of similar vision by governments. We know the endemic problems of Europe. Are you perceiving, seeing, working on groups that are going to deliver this, in your view, in a sort of reasonable timeline? Are you optimistic that this is going to happen?
I'm not very optimistic on time. I think the consciousness of the urgency is not there. You see, I've been in the NAC, so the NATO, the North Atlantic Council in La Haye in July, the first one for Mr. Trump. And my feeling was that some, I would not say most, but some, and some is a lot, in fact, some countries, in fact, don't believe we are in a difficult position. And so they are still sneaking with, yes, but 2% is still okay. We are not in a hurry, and so we don't need to be serious. I personally think, as a military person, that we are in a hurry. I think the new commodity is time, and so it's probably the one we lack the more. And when I see the gold stock price, I see I would say the time as a commodity is probably the same curve. We lack time, and so it's why each day needs to we need to do the good things. We need to change the regulations. We need really to have a political impulsion to break the things today that makes impossible addressing the question. I will give you some. I'm meeting some venture capitalists and fundraisers, and what they say to their people in Europe, they say, do not invest in Europe. You will never make your money. Go to the US. Because there you have a market, there you have a demand signal, and then you will make your money. So if we want to change that, we need to change the rules. It's about all the regulation, the fact that we envisaged defense as a market with the same rules than the civilian market makes a lot of complexity. And so if we want to be serious, we need to change the rules. Changing rules is a political issue.
Thank you so much, and I hear your frustration. It's a frustration that, in general, in many of us in Europe feel for this sentiment that we should somehow do things, but then it's all kind of left to tomorrow to try and do something concrete. Particularly interesting is your reference to VCs and the way in which they perceive the investment in Europe. After this, we'll have a panel that will talk precisely about the way in which the finance community, the VCs and the private equity and the family offices are thinking about the opportunity in defense. But let me stop here and thank you so much. Ask the room to join me in thanking you for this insight, which is setting up the rest of the panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you.
So I don't know, I wanted to jump straight to ESBEN, who might, there you are, who is at the airport, because the Admiral said you are perfectly ESBEN. You're at the airport going, in fact, from Copenhagen to Ukraine, as I understand, so what more topical, speaking in the parliament in Copenhagen this morning. So you are essentially at the core of this, in the sense that you're a founder of the Defense Innovation Highway, essentially pushing the notion that the Ukraine war should be a real catalyst for what we need to do in Europe. And so it is important to hear how you, as an investor, as a tech startup, think about this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Does the sound go well? You hear me?
We can hear you.
Good, very good. So I'm sorry I could not be there, but as correct, I'm going to the airport now and going to Ukraine. So I will say clearly also what we just discussed, that the system is too slow. And you can say much of our systems is actually made in the mindset, which is also good. It's just not good for war, which is that we never want to make a mistake. And that is still how the government organizations, academia, states fund, institutional funds, etc., are working. The problem is that that is a recipe for how to lose a war, because you lose a war on not doing things fast. So if we look to Ukraine, then they say that the average lifetime of a factory in Ukraine is 12 months. That's what they said 12 months ago. So it's probably less now. So you don't have one big factory, you have 10 factories, and you hide them as much as you can and try to get them underground if possible. In that circumstance, being at war, they still managed to produce 4.5 million drones last year. And the plan this year is to produce 8 million. This is absolutely insane that they can do that. So of course, in Europe, if we wanted, we could produce much more than they can do in Ukraine. Yeah, so another thing we see in Ukraine is also even when they are in war, the military is actually having some challenges of catching up with the speed. So what you see in Ukraine is that it's not the military that is starting to procure the first drones to the front line. It's because some of our brothers is out there, they are civilians that joined the military, and now they tried this thing with drones and it's working. So they call some people back home in Kyiv and say, we need some more drones. And then you have civilian organizations stepping up, making a huge impact. So the first drones in Ukraine and so much of the new innovations have been led by civilian defense organizations in Ukraine. That has been going on for some years now. So now they have gotten a recognition and have a good collaboration with the military. So one example is Victory drones that have been training more than 170,000 drone pilots in Ukraine. We have Come Back Alive, we have Partula Foundation. So we have several of these civilian organizations. And here I have one question, and that is something that we only need to see in Ukraine, that the civilian organizations, that the tech community have a speed that is actually also applicable and needed if we end up being in war? Or is it only something that is happening in a Ukrainian context? I think not. I think it's also relevant here, and I think it's very clear now that we had 9 delegations to Ukraine last year, and we brought many different types of people, academia, military, but also investors, and both small startups, but also big primes. Our main focus is on the Nordic countries, so that's where most of the people have been from. But what we see in Ukraine now is that almost all the investors there, that's private business angels that are investing from Europe in defense tech in Ukraine. And then it's very small funds. And they are small not because they don't want to be small, but because in the Nordic countries, they have not been able to raise more than a handful of million euros. And that's what they are deploying in Ukraine. And it's making a difference. So where are the institutional funds after almost 4 years of war? They are still not active in the Silicon Valley of defense, which is Ukraine. So I think that's a good indication. Another indication is that one example like European Defense Tech Hackathon that is doing defense hackathons very well connected to Ukraine all over Europe. And they have a speed. This is also, it's a German and a Swedish guy that are just doing this all over the place. And that is also having a serious impact. So one thing that I started to think about lately is that do we actually in Europe need Ukraine more than they need us? They have the know-how to fight with Russia. They want to fight, and they have an incredible innovation. We have a lot of smart people here. The problem with all our smart people is that very, very, very few of them know what is the challenge in Ukraine, and much less are working on those challenges. So we have the best technical universities and the smartest companies, but very few of them is actually wanting, or maybe they want to, but they don't know how to connect and how to find out what do they need in Ukraine. So I think if we manage to take our universities and get them properly connected and actually get them up to speed, not with another PhD in 5 years, but with something that can be applied and be helpful in Ukraine in this war, then we will solve first and foremost, the very urgent crisis with the war, but secondly, that will also solve our Draghi problems with competition, because we will get an innovation culture into our universities that I think will trickle down to everything else we do in Europe. My last point is we have some events we do in Kyiv with local defense companies to help them to understand how to navigate European or international investors and how to work with primes, etc. And I asked a question to them some months ago, and we had like 40 defense tech companies in the room, and I said, sometimes I wonder if the biggest defense company in Europe in 10 years will be one of the new innovative companies built these years. What do you think? And then Yaroslav, he said, that's not going to happen. It's going to take 20 years. Because NATO will take more than 10 years to rearrange and will trickle down how the orders are being made so that it will fit with modern warfare the way that we see it in Ukraine. But then he said, no, it can happen within 10 years, but that will happen if there will be war outside of Ukraine in Europe. If there will be another war, then we will have to do like they have had to do in Ukraine, which is not looking at what we planned, but looking at what is working, because that's how we need to do it. And then the last thing I will say is that I have a boy at the age of 15, and if we have to go to war, we need to do exactly what they do in Ukraine, which is saying fight with robots, not with humans, because my son is not going to be in the front line. The robots will be there, the drones will be there, and he have to be in safe distance and then control these things. And then, okay, there was one thing I forgot. So one thing that gives me a lot of hope and a potential piece of a puzzle of a Ukrainian victory is all the very, very innovative projects that are being done, both in Ukraine, but also in Europe and also, of course, in America. There is a lot of things being developed, and it's important that we make sure we will take enough risk on these things. And right now, it's very, very needed to take more risk on some of these innovations, especially in Ukraine, because they really lack funding there. Unfortunately, what we see in Ukraine is that basically almost the majority of the money in Ukrainian defense technology is American money. So, and some of the American money come with really, really tough terms, meaning that these very good tech people in Ukraine that have very little business experience, they accept terms that in reality make sure that this company will end up being an American company. So even though Silicon Valley is in Europe, we actually see that the Americans are those that understand what is going on, and they are doing what they can, and they are quite successful with that, actually getting this technology to end up being American defense technology. So we have an even bigger dependency in Europe, instead of making sure that this will stay in Ukraine and in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. And this is really an incredible overview of what is really going on. And multiple points that you touched upon, I think, are fascinating. Certainly, the last one you end up in is where we always look at one another and say, what can you do? I mean, we seem to, again, recognize, admire the problem, and then Americans are faster at acting, and we are just somewhat behind. The Admiral laid out very clearly his own frustration about how it is going to be taking time, and yet your description of the agility and the speed and the ability of the Ukrainians to act under pressure is, of course, something we know, but is inspirational. Let me turn to our next speaker, JEROMIN. You have talked in particular about the demand signal, the demand procurement that the general, that the Admiral referred to as being a major focus, because we know that the reality, as the Admiral also alluded to, is there is a lot of inefficiency, duplication, and there's the question of whether the money is going to be enough. So how is this kind of effort that needs to be made going to be funded? There are proposals out there. Moritz Schulerich and others have written a paper about a particular proposal for funding the effort. Would you describe that piece and what you think we should do and what you think we will do?
Thank you, Christina. A pleasure to be here, and also to say from the outset that I agreed with almost everything the Admiral said. So we meaning Guntram Wolf, Armin Steinbach, who's now the Director General for Economic Policy, the Chief Economist of the German Ministry of Finance, and myself wrote a somewhat longer paper than the short piece you were referring to in April last year, where we essentially laid out the case for something we call the European Defense Mechanism, which contains some of the ingredients of the paper by Elaine Moritz and Philipp Hildebrand, but goes a bit further. And so essentially the key idea of that paper is that the two things that we need to get right is to pool demand, to increase scale, and make the procurement process more efficient. So this is a goal that has been held for a very long time, but we have been very unsuccessful in doing it. Why have we been very unsuccessful? Because of a mixture of being locked into past standards, which is something the Admiral mentioned, but also because of simple defense industrial nationalism at the at the country level in Europe. And this is an area that has been very carefully protected in the European treaties. So Article 346 of the TFEU essentially exempts anything related to national security from single market requirements. And so the holy grail is to attack that. I will say in a second how one goes about it. And then the other very critical element that we need to get right is competition. I mean, we have, the two are linked, of course, so we have a market that is dominated by national champions, and we need them to compete at the European level, and we also need to have a much friendlier environment for entry. So those are the things we need to get right. As far as the financing side is, in a sense, it's the lesser of our problems. Why? Because the decision to allocate large fiscal resources at the national level has already been made, at least in a few large countries that matter. And in theory, in all countries, because the 3.5 NATO goal is common to all countries. So it's more about the efficient use of that funding than about funding itself. This said, I do agree, and this is part of our proposal from last April, that in order to reconcile the fact that some large European countries are borrowing constrained, they cannot raise a lot of debt in a short time, but at the same time that we cannot have those countries that are not borrowing constrained contribute disproportionately to what ultimately should be common European defense assets. To solve that puzzle, we do need a funding capacity, right? So in that sense, I mean, that part of their proposal is already in our thing and essentially identical, right? The only difference is they argue that we should do it through a change in the ESM treaty. We say, well, we could maybe do it through existing EU bonds or through a new outfit. That's really the main difference.
And how do you see the take-up of that proposal, of your proposal? Because it is, of course, a smart idea, but you know, there's doing and there's proposing.
Look, so when we presented this, so to be fair, our audience was not the leaders, our audience was not the ministers of finance, our audience was the ministers not the ministers of defense, our audience was the ministers of finance, right? And I don't know how much I can go into detail without violating the Chatham House rules of that meeting and subsequent meetings, but you can more or less line this up geographically. So Nordic countries, Eastern European countries, even the Netherlands, they were really positive on this proposal. They essentially wanted this. There was even one Baltic country that offered their capital as the future seat of the new organization that we were proposing. Then you have the South is kind of neither here nor there, but at the margin they are in favor because of the funding, the common bond issuing aspect of it, and because they want to be good Europeans in general. That's true for Spain, for example, which very much supported our proposal. The big problem is France and Germany. Why are they the big problem? Because France has a very strong tradition of defense industrial nationalism, and because Germany is reflexively against new ideas that involve common borrowing, even if these ideas are defined in the most incentive-compatible way possible. Because remember, this is completely different from the RRF, right? So this is not, and you know, many in this room will think the RRF was probably quite good relative to previous common borrowing experiments. So this is not about common debt to then hand it to a country and give the country a large degree of autonomy how to spend it. This is about common debt to buy a common asset that's under common ownership. So you have both sides of the balance sheet that involve a common structure. No economist can find fault with that, except my compatriots, unfortunately, because they simply freak out at the idea of common debt per se. They also don't like the idea of having a new international organization. But on this one we back down. So we have a new version of the proposal that was published at the end of November in a CEPR publication, where we argued that you could use existing EU institutions to pull this off.
This is fantastic, very super interesting, because this is the real politic that ultimately prevents actual moving forward. Let me bring in Nathan Lane if he's online. I can see he should be online. Yes, Nathan, hi. Good to have you. I know you're teaching obligations today prevented you from being here in person. You've been at this conference a couple of years ago in person, but the reason you're here, of course, you are a noted scholar of industrial policy. You focus lately your work on defense, and you very much emphasize that defense is industrial policy. With all of the attributes that that has, it matters because it has potential positive spillovers in the civilian sector, and that's why we need to think about it as industrial policy. It is also the case that, like every industrial policy, it needs to be properly designed in order to generate these positive spillovers. Will you give us a brief sense for how you think that design of the policy should go in order to generate the useful civilian and vice versa spillover that are potentially associated with it? Thank you.
No, thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure and a joy to attend this conference virtually. It's an era, right, I think it's so prescient, and so I truly wish I were there and not teaching here. To answer your question, the premise of your question, I do think is really right, that there's a huge opportunity here if we do think of European rearmament, this moment in European defense industrial buildup as an industrial policy. And really, there's no debate anymore whether it's industrial policy or not. We just see this is very, very hard industrial policy in a way that I'm not accustomed to seeing here, of course, especially the emphasis on the demand side. And so I want to say two things about just how we as economists think about R&D and military procurement. We agree that R&D has huge spillovers, such as the spillovers that could maybe address the issues that Draghi and Letta kind of speak to intellectually. Like, a lot of the evidence we know about R&D comes from, in fact, military spillovers, of it working, of its efficacy. So that's one thing. But two, and what's emerging lately is that as economists, we're understanding that the demand side is incredibly important. And of course, we're late to the game, just as we were late to the game with industrial policy. And a lot of our evidence came from the supply side, that, oh, we know how to design all these supply side instruments to perhaps promote these social spillovers and externalities that come from military, R&D spending and things like that. But the demand side signal evidence is really, really mounting, and it's mounting at a time that's, of course, very trenchant. And so I see EU procurement as indeed an opportunity, as a real opportunity to kind of address these structural issues that Draghi and Letta allude to, right? And I'd say kind of you can summarize 4 principles, and I'm going to be high level, 4 principles that are kind of emerging from the literature. And also, I say kind of because it's also coming from the anecdotal evidence that we observe when it comes to practice. So those 4 things I would say are specifying the outcomes, not the inputs. Investing in the capabilities of the actual institutions that do procurement. And opening the door to entry and the kind of non-traditional suppliers who encompass and kind of construct and are the kind of innovators that we ultimately want to champion and who are shut out from this system often. And that entails also the 4th thing, which I think is bridging the valley of death. In designing procurement, we talk a lot about demand signals. To create a demand signal such that we can bridge the valley of death, we have endless prototypes. How do we actually get to outcomes? How do we actually get to market outcomes? And so I think procurement's a huge opportunity there, huge opportunity there. And so if I think of the way procurement systems are optimized, right? They're biased towards, especially if we're talking about military procurement in the EU. I don't have to remark much on it. We have all kind of characterized it, I think, very, very well. But it's, of course, biased towards and optimized towards a certain type of good, a certain type of industrial activity, a certain type of legacy good, legacy platforms, things like that. And of course, how do we square that with the demands of Legge and Draghi? So these 4 principles, if we think of the first principle, just specify problems, not products, that's something that's become really important to us. And it might seem obvious to others that if we can completely contract for something in a procurement contract, right, then it probably exists. right? That it probably existed, that the innovation we're trying to stem or trying to promote is a lot different. It's a much different type of innovation that we're going for when we're trying to stipulate a product in detail. So when we start writing contracts and designing a procurement system to specify problems, persistence, surveillance capabilities, and contested environments, rather than the dimensions of a wing or the dimensions of an aircraft, right? This stuff really matters. We see evidence of this from the US Air Force procurement system. This open topic reforms that happened the last decade, actually the 2010s, which really had a large effect on kind of promoting more pie in the sky thinking and innovation rather than just kind of things that already exist. Mm-hmm. And so thinking about the types of products we're contracting for really, really matters. And that gets us to that, it entails a lot of discretion. That entails a lot of kind of different type of expertise from procurement officials. And so that gets me to this is the second point, which is we need to invest in procurement capability in procurement institutions. And that might sound, again, pretty obvious, but the kind of innovation that we want to promote, the type of kind of complex new technologies that we want to provide a demand signal for, that entails, well, hopefully a lot of discretion, but an expertise that isn't usually embodied in these places. We need to do the opposite of what the US is doing. Well, the US is hemorrhaging PhDs and hemorrhaging talented personnel from their procurement departments. And we need to do just the opposite, absolutely the opposite. And that sounds obvious, but there's really detailed evidence on this, that the procurement people matter, that having procurement people have knowledge of all the things we talked about today truly, truly does matter. And when we're talking about new technologies, this stuff takes a fair amount of discretion as well. So we have to invest in and allow for the discretion of the people kind of at the helm of these decisions. And so the third thing is also thinking about access. And I think a lot of people touched on that today, which I completely agree with. Everyone alluded to this. We think of a procurement system that's often, we said, kind of charitable to national champions, that is kind of out of the reach and kind of inaccessible to the SMEs that we ultimately want to promote. In fact, the startups we often want to promote. And we have a lot of new supply side policies that are going to affect into the startup space that do have an effect. But when it comes to access and accessing the military procurement market and accessing that demand signal, that promise of stable demand, like that's a whole other story. And I think that also addresses some of the competition issues that not only Letta and Draghi talk about, but some of what we've been talking about in this panel.
So can you close in a minute because we are very pressed. That was it.
That's
oh,
it.
fabulous,
Yeah,
fabulous.
we'll
Okay, excellent. So let me go back to the live. Thank you so much, Nathan. The live panel here on stage. I want to turn to the Commission, of course, Guillaume de la Brosse. Thank you so much for joining us. So let's start from the Commission issuing, of course, a document which is being well received last November, the Defense Industry Transformation Roadmap, that in theory or in principle, when you read it, makes a lot of sense because it makes all of the right noises. Innovation is a critical component, leveraging the experience of Ukraine, bringing together new players, all of these kind of things are very much there, and there is an expansive discussion, absolutely making all the right point. And there is a tantalizing array of proposals in there from, in order to turn Europe into a defense powerhouse. There is a fund-to-fund defense equity facility. There's various proposals. Now, talk us through what you see as the most realistic of these initiatives. All sounds very nice. Is it going to happen? Or when is it going to happen? And when is it going to kick in? And what is it going to look like? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina. Thank you so much for having me on the panel as well. So it's not just about noises, it's going to be a big concrete actions. So I'll bring you through that. But before, just like 2025 has been a long journey on defense. Just to give you a bit the big picture, in very, to the point, right? But we started the year with alarming signals from different intelligence services in different member states that after Ukraine, or in parallel to Ukraine, we may have Baltic states next on the queue when it comes to a possible attack from Russia, right? So the question was very simple, and we had to frame that question as part of the white paper. We always need a paper just to frame the question, to frame the problem we need to fix. The question was very simple. Are we ready for that scenario, right? So, and then we had...
But the answer is kind of no,
wait,
right?
I mean,
and do you need a paper?
And that's fine, but you need to align the thinking first. If not, I mean, then the Commission is blamed for advancing too fast, etc. So you need to frame the debate. And then we had 3 key drivers. Driver number 1 was scale. How can we give financial firepower to member states for them to rearm quickly? This is SAFE, the Security Action for Europe. And actually, this is about speed. Just for you to know, I mean, we've drafted that piece of regulation in 2 weeks. It has been adopted by member states in 4 weeks. And we thought 150 billion of loans to be granted to member states in 1 round. Will that happen? So let's go for 2 rounds. Actually, in 1 round, everything has been allocated to member states. So there was a clear demand on the side of member states to have much more financial capacity to spend on defense. So this is about scale, right? So 150 billion of loans. It's not far away, actually, from what you've described about this defense mechanism, because it's about the Commission issuing bonds on the markets, and then we allocate loans to member states. Member states will have 45 years to reimburse, 10 years of grace periods. So even the US were telling us, but how did you manage to get such conditions, right? So that's about SAFE, 150 billion of loans granted to member states for them to spend in procurement for certain equipment, not everything, we've listed where member states have to invest, for delivery by 2030, because that's the horizon that we need to get. So scale was the first driver, and the reply is, in less than 2 months, SAFE. Second driver is agility. So we need to be much more agile to achieve this defense readiness 2030. And this is where this transformation roadmap comes into place. We need agility on the side of the industry. And for us to get there, we need to bring close connections between defense and the tech industry. So this is really precisely the purpose of this defense transformation roadmap, transforming defense through the tech industry. And this is very much, I mean, as we've heard from the investor, about learning from Ukraine as well, right? So Ukraine is managing to resist thanks to the innovative ecosystem they've put in place and through the connection with AI companies, space-based companies, quantum companies, robotics, etc. And that's exactly what we want to achieve. So just a few ideas that we have set up. Tech alliances. How can we build tech alliances around space, around quantum, around AI, and bring them closer to the defense ministries? We've heard defense ministries, it's complex, they don't know to whom they have to talk to, they don't understand procurement, so we are kind of acting as a honest broker between tech companies, tech alliances, and defense ministries, number 1. Number 2, what we want as well is to have in Europe a new instrument by which we can deliver very quickly to defense ministries low-cost products. Because that's one of the lessons learned from Ukraine as well. Bringing on the table and off-the-shelf products that are low cost. And here it's about really tapping into the potential of the deep tech companies as well, right? So that's a new instrument that we are putting together that will be operational in 2027. Name is Agile. So, and the third element, you mentioned that as well, is a fund of funds. Why? Because we know that all these companies, startups, scale-ups, they need access to capital. I slightly disagree with Admiral Vandier, small nuance. I do, and when you look at what's happening in terms of investors, you have lots of investors flying away from the US, looking into Europe. Why? Because they want predictability, right? And at least we have that in Europe. And we see lots of investors now turning into Europe. Of course, there is big money, so it creates attraction. But now what we want is creating a fund of fund, at least one, it's going to be 1 billion, 1.5 billion certainly, together with the European Investment Fund and the European Investment Bank, so that we have much more VCs and private equities, you mentioned family office, pension funds, participating in investment round of startups, scale-ups, not just pre-seed, seed, Series A, but growth funding, so late-stage funding, because this is where actually we're lacking the financial firepower. So that's what we want to fix as well, and this is very much in the making. I mean, we're going to have that fund. First investment round will be done first semester, so this fund will scout the market very, very soon then. And so that second element, second driver was agility. The third driver is flagships. So what we want as well is there are certain capabilities where we believe member states cannot act on their own, they need to team up, right? In the field of space, in the field of drones, in the field of the Eastern Flank Watch, in the field of air missile defense. This is where we need really to think across the board, across different member states, and we're trying to incentivize member states to think collectively. So not just, I mean, to go beyond national borders, but to really to put in place EU wide infrastructures to face the most pressing threat. So this is very much, again, what the key drivers, so scale, agility, and flagships that we have for this year. Now, there is a new question for 2026, which is, how can we face that situation without the US? So that's the next question that we need to fix this year. Of course, I mean, it's about how can we bring capability coalition with third countries, like-minded third countries, and this is how can we plug dependencies we have from the US. I mean, strategic enablers were mentioned, so like air to fuelings, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, strategic airlift. So we have plenty of dependencies because those capabilities were provided by the US. So the question is, how can we act in a more independent way now?
This is great, and I love to hear the focus that the Commission, you are putting on the integration of the vision with the finance world, the private funding. That is something we're going to discuss in the next panel. How to do away or less with the US? I mean, hello. I mean, this is the whole topic. It's not just from this year. The issue of dependency has been absolutely huge for quite some time. And so if this isn't an opportunity right now for Europe to muscle up and really concretely get out of these dependencies, I don't know what is. Let me turn to our next speaker. I'm sorry you've been patient waiting. BART, from the European Parliament, you've of course been very involved in defense issues, and I'd like you to just comment on what you heard from the Commission or anything else that you would like to say at this point.
Well, the subject of today's conference is on European tech sovereignty. And if you think that you can achieve anything on tech sovereignty without building somewhat of a sovereign military force, you're wrong. Don't say we need to decouple from the Americans, we need to keep them closer, but we need to do more. Now, first, let me look at the fact. The Turnberry deal. We took a unilateral concession of 15% tariffs without doing anything in return. Why? Von der Leyen told us. It's the US military support that we expect to get whenever we are attacked by our adversaries, our enemies, Russia mainly. If you look at DSA, DMA, we want to enforce our own tech standards and our own tech sovereign space. What does J.D. Vance say? We'll pull out of NATO if you do so. If you look at export controls, ASML from my country or other countries, also look at Seoul, also look at Tokyo. Countries completely dependent on US military force for their basic security. What do? They follow. So if you want to have anything to say on tech sovereignty, start building a more sovereign military. That's the main topic of today. Now, if we look at what has been said by the Secretary General of the past days, he said, for the next 10, 20 years, you'll be dependent on America. Well, right, and maybe rightfully so. I don't mind. What I do want is less America, become more soft. That's what the Americans ask of us. Our firepower combined could be there if we have all the strategic enablers and strategic weapon systems on which we are currently, like the Commission just said, are dependent on the US. Look at Robert Gates, the defense minister in 2010. He said his farewell speech. You should read it. It's online. He said, after doing the Libya mission, an air policing mission, very simple. Europe should do its task in its own backyard. But after 4-5 weeks, we came back to the US. Could you please help us? We don't have munition, it's yours. We don't have intelligence, sensor to shooter, that's American. Air-to-air refueling, could you provide us with that? Etc., etc., etc. So all the enablers, and the command and control ship in the Mediterranean was eventually US. So all these enablers, you should have in European hands. It's doubling. If you ask NATO, what kind of capability gap assessment do we have? You know what NATO says? Don't matter. Don't matter. The Americans already taking care of these enablers. That's doubling. I say, okay, but maybe we need to double. I take into account the lessons of Robert Gates, because what Robert Gates said in his farewell speech was, we're blowing up NATO. The Europeans, not because they don't want to engage with NATO, because they can't. So if you're asking what is Parliament doing, the only thing we're doing is writing these words, these 2 sentences, magic sentences my team knows. We should buy all those strategic enablers and strategic weapon systems that the US currently provides for ourselves now. Not to distance the US from us, but to keep them closer. They want to have more maneuver space in Asia and in the Indo-Pacific. Fine. We'll take care of our own more. It's with less America, not without America. And this is the lesson that we should draw. And to be honest, I see too little urgency. I feel a little bit of panic. And I miss the urgency, the panic in Brussels. I want to see more panic. And to be honest, the real solution, therefore, is not 100% NATO, because of the capability assessment gap. It's not an EU army, to be honest. Not at all. What Commissioner Kubilius said in Sweden, I thought was appalling. But I do think that if you look back, if historians would look back on history, I think that the gathering in Keir Starmer's number 10 office, let's say a month or 5 or 6 ago, the Turks came, the Norwegians came, Iceland came, the UK was there, European Union was there, all the Europeans there together for continental security. I hope that historians one day will say this was the birth of the European Security Council, taking into account the security, taking security matters on the continent in their own hand. This is the birth. And if I would say what should happen, and on the very short term, we do an exercise with the coalition of the willing. And that coalition of willing on the eastern border, a large-scale Article 5, just like Zapad, what the Russians are doing. You organize a huge 100,000, 200,000 soldier scenario, and you look at what enablers do we miss. Are we able to get there logistically? If there are cruise missiles coming in, do we have EW capabilities? Can we do command and control? And you organize such a practice practically, and act accordingly. The best way to kill European defense is to think everything through, have all think tanks write reports about it, because you'll be talking about Eurobonds, about EU armies, you'll have a fight. The best way to kill it is to think it through. Start. Just start with a coalition of the willing, large-scale maneuver at our eastern borders.
Well, I couldn't agree more. Just start is really the motto. And, you know, I share with you the notion that somehow our hair is on fire and there is no sense of panic yet. So let me finish with KATJA from Chatham House. KATJA, you can riff on any of these topics, but particularly perhaps on the sort of the dual use opportunity defense tech boom, which is where we're going next with the next panel. But take it as you like.
Thank you, Christina.
Yeah, it will come.
Yeah, okay. Cool. So yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Christina. It's I was just thinking it was funny that we have these this conference today in sort of the waning days of January, because somehow it's still January, and I think this will go down right as sort of one of these pivot months in history, where sort of the old is definitely no longer the old, but we don't quite yet know what the new is going to be. I hope also that this is a moment, or at least this month, where we start to feel that sort of urgency that everyone's been mentioning, that we're missing both sort of on the defense question and the tech question. I feel something has shifted this month, and then I feel this might maybe also be the month where we do start to recognize that as a continent we do actually hold quite many strategic cards, that we are in a position really to maybe not tomorrow, but quite soon, like sooner maybe, if you put real energy behind it, then we think be a sort of credible third pole in a quite chaotic world, right, where everyone else is also looking for sort of new sources of certainty. And within that, I think that kind of speaking on this defense topic, so usually when I speak about this, it's more the sort of big picture topics that we've just been discussing, but today I thought I would zoom in on a quite specific slice, as Christina mentioned, the sort of defense dual use moment that we're going through as Europe. And I think it's a quite interesting microcosm as well of what Europe can actually do, how we can kind of achieve autonomy in some of these domains, but also really have an opportunity there to kickstart some of these ideas really and kind of reap spillover benefits from all of this defense spending that can strengthen Europe's tech sovereignty writ large. So to do that, actually, I'm going to do a thing that we don't often do, and I think we should do a little bit more of, which is to more intimately connect this defense question that we have and this tech sovereignty question that we have. So we don't really talk enough that these are intimately intertwined, of course. We talk about cloud dependencies, but innovation that can happen in one sphere can very much spill over in the other and vice versa. So I think to do that, I'm going to flip it around a little bit and just talk about the sort of dynamics of the AI race. So when we've been talking a lot today about sort of Europe falling behind on frontier AI, but that's just one aspect of the AI race that we have, right? Because there's really three aspects to it, and this doesn't just apply to AI, it really does to other technologies as well, which is this race to the frontier, who builds the best AI quickest. Well, they're a little bit behind. I'm not saying it's irrecoverably behind, but obviously we're not a player there. But there are the other two races, the races for diffusion, like how do you spread your model for AI or your AI Eurostack, if you will, to the rest of the world. And this race for adoption as well, like how do you permeate this as quickly as possible in different aspects of your economies, including militaries, right? And I think this defense spending moment that we're going through and this defense tech boom that we're going through are quite an interesting kind of mechanism by which we can actually be more significant players in some of this, because particularly these last two races for diffusion and adoption, they haven't really been lost, right? And these are still areas where Europe can do extremely well, and it's been mentioned a couple of times today. So kind of on this frontier question, like I think it's clear that, like we don't really have sovereign kind of capabilities here across the stack. We're not operating like some of the frontier US companies are. We can wonder if that's even really what you want to achieve at this point. If we look at the model China has for winning the AI race, might be a better model for us and ultimately perhaps also the successful one. But one area where I do think we really have potential to operate at the frontier when it comes to AI is this sort of defense tech moment that we're going through. And when I say that, what I mean with that is that despite, and I'll go through those in a second, there are some serious limitations there as well in how well we're able to kind of capitalize some of the interest right now in defense tech. I do think this is an area where Europe does a lot better than it does in general AI, right? So if we now look, when it comes to specifically defense tech, Europe is, by some accounts, the fastest growing market, but suddenly one of the fastest growing major markets in the world for new investment. We see, I think Ursula von der Leyen mentioned it in her Davos speech, that 3 of the largest or kind of most promising European unicorns that we have, they're defense tech companies. We see new funds launching all the time, so I know it was mentioned before, there's not enough access to funding, but it has actually significantly increased in recent years. I think we had 3, 4 dedicated funds just a couple of years ago, now there are 8. I think another big one was launched just last week. So no, there is more capital available, and what's interesting as well, and I think, and this is more a weak signal, right, like a soft signal, if you will, is that you just see that a lot of these companies becoming active in this space, they really do this not just because there's money on the table from defense spending, but also at this sort of sense of patriotism really for Europe. Like we need to be supporting Ukraine, we need to be able to support Ukraine, and in support for European sovereignty, really. And I think that that's what we're seeing, and I think that's interesting when we've spoken a lot about fragmentation, is that a lot of these companies, your Helsings, etc., they don't per se present themselves as Italian, German, British, but they present themselves as European champions, which is new. So even if on the demand side we still see fragmentation, at least on the supply side we see something that looks quite a lot more European than it used to. So to kind of bring it back, so that's, I think, kind of on the frontier aspect of it. And I think this is an area where there's a lot of issues that we face. I won't go in full detail because I know we're a bit pressed for time, but we need to unlock more funding here. Obviously, it's only very recently, for example, that the European Investment Bank will touch anything dual use at all. The pension funds, some of the others that have been mentioned, they need to be spending on this, let go of some of these ESG limitations. Still, European defense companies, they can't even open bank accounts occasionally. These are massive kind of hurdles to overcome. Risk-taking needs to be overcome. Also, when we just look, Europe might be growing fast, but when you just look at NATO overall defense tech spending, actually 90% still goes to US companies. So we're growing fast in that 10%, but we're still horribly kind of outmatched. But all of this notwithstanding, I think this is an interesting moment and one you can make more of and kind of build this brand Europe around. So that's race one, the race to the frontier, maybe the harder one to participate in, but one we can, I think, be a player on by focusing on defense. 1 minute, and I'll just the other two I'll keep very brief. I think when it comes to this race for kind of adoption, I think we really need to radically rethink our thinking, and this is quite important. And this is move to a model of good enough, right? Because we're still always talking about, oh, we cannot really match the US, we don't have these capabilities. Some we definitely don't. That's a reality. They're going to be uptake upwards to a decade or so, some of these to be resolved. Some of them have been mentioned in the defense sphere, we know about them in the tech sphere as well. But for some of this, we do actually have European alternatives available. And you can take a lesson from China's book in saying, well, why don't we kind of accept that some of the just good enough maybe solutions, domestic challenges that we have in Europe, and use them at least, even if you do believe that the US might have our back when it came to it, to have some alternatives in place. And we do have a good kind of precedent for this. I thought it was quite heartening earlier this year, which was, I think, kind of that moment that really kickstarted Europe's moment kind of tech sovereignty as more of a national security imperative as well, which was that sort of Starlink Maxar moment, right, where the Americans threatened to turn it off and briefly did, even in the case of Maxar, is that we immediately looked at kind of the European challenges that we did have. So we had Eutelsat, it's not Starlink, it won't be Starlink for some time, but we adopted it because it's better for Ukraine to have something that's pretty good and patched together than nothing at all. And that's a sort of mindset that you would need to be embracing here for the next 10 years. And kind of also if you want these companies to actually properly compete ever, right? So you need to increase your tolerance for things that might not be optimal, but they're European and they're sovereign. And they can help us kind of on this pathway to independence and become thriving companies this way.
Thank you.
Yes, okay.
Thank you. We're late, and so I just want to give 1 minute for the three of you if you have one last 30-second comment at all. Otherwise, we can just go to coffee.
Can I make my last paragraph as my
Wait, because I cannot not give them the last word.
One more is risk-taking. I fully subscribe to what was said on the risk-taking. I think this is, that's part of, I mean, if we want to rearm very quickly, to be ready for what happens, we need to be much more open to risk-taking. So that's for me the mantra this year.
We must overcome defense industrial nationalism within Europe. That's the key. I cannot believe we are still in these silly national red lines when we were about to be eaten alive.
And between the US and Europe, we thought we would keep the Americans close by buying F-35s and American kit. Fine. But that's not the problem, like I said. We should become more sovereign so they have their hands free to pivot to Asia. But then the question is, if we in the European Union, Europeans are spending more money, we should have something to say on how that money is being spent. Consolidation in the market, I agree. And, I mean, there's lots and lots and lots and lots of fun we can make. But the future is bright. Okay.
All right. Katja, if you want 30 seconds, but really I need to wrap it up.
Yes. And I just wanted to say is that, you know, we've come out of an era of 30 years really of peace dividend thinking. This could be a moment of defense dividend thinking. And I do think it's quite promising. So that if you look, we've been talking a lot about Silicon Valley. It was born out of government spending, defense spending. Its actual origins before the early Cold War were actually in the US trying to decouple itself from British hegemony and choke points. No? So we have a very clear precedent, I just wanted to say, of this successfully actually
very good.
Creating a market.
Okay,
yes.
So let me just wrap up. I'm sorry we're running a bit late, but I've got another 2 panels after this and a fireside. So please have coffee. Join me in thanking this great group because they were amazing. I learned a lot. Back in 15 minutes, no longer. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. It was great. Thank you, JEROMIN. Thank you so much for coming.